Well, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. I'm really excited to speak to you. I'm going to kick off with what might seem like an obvious question, because you've decided to come to a talk about mental health. What is mental health? In fact, the answer to this question varies dramatically depending on who you ask. If you ask a behavioral neuroscientist, someone who does animal research, maybe they're a psychopharmacologist, they want to know what drugs might help mental health, they'll tell you something like, "Ooh, well, it's like how fast a rat might run through a water maze." If you ask an economist, they might tell you, well, it's how satisfied someone feels with their life. How can these two definitions, and a myriad other definitions you might be familiar with, be talking about the same concept? I think that they are. I think they're both related to how the brain computes our sense of mental health. And some of that actually has to do with how quickly a rat might run through a water maze. And a lot of that has to do with how we might perceive our general sense of self, sense of life, perceptions of the world around us. And that's what I want to talk to you about tonight. Where does mental health come from? Our subjective sense of mental health, a poor sense of mental health, feeling better, feeling worse. There are a few misconceptions about mental health that I hope we can unravel together. The first is that there is some distinction between social explanations of mental health, something traumatic you've experienced, difficulty you've had in childhood, and a biological explanation of mental health, like your genes have made you this way. This division is artificial, and in fact, ultimately, very unhelpful. Both factors play a role in your mental health, but at the proximal level, at the close level, what's happening are processes in the brain, even if some far away affecting mechanism is in your genes or in your social environment or a combination of both. They affect your mental health by changing things in the brain and, I would argue, in the wider nervous system. So the second misconception I would hope to talk to you about tonight is the separation between mental and physical health. It's a distinction that seems important, but that actually holds us back, potentially even from new and really significant developments in mental health treatment. And finally, I want to talk to you about silver bullets. All of you have read about potential silver bullets, maybe this month, maybe the month before, maybe last year. They come in the form of psychedelic treatments, meditation. Actually, all treatments have at some point probably been described as a silver bullet, the final thing that will treat our mental health and improve our society's well-being. I, unfortunately, not to start off on a negative note, don't think there will ever be a single silver bullet for a mental health condition. But that's actually because of something really, really fascinating. The labels that we've decided to give mental health diagnoses, say something like depression, exist for a reason. They help us, but they're not entirely scientifically valid. They don't necessarily cut nature at its joints, describe what the biological mechanisms underpinning that diagnosis might be. In fact, I think there's very good reason to believe that even in two people with the very same diagnosis, different biological mechanisms might be causing their symptoms. So for that reason, I think we need a much closer mapping between our understanding of what's causing mental health and poor mental health and what we should use to treat mental health. I don't think we should be looking for a silver bullet. I'm going to start with pain, not classically considered a mental health condition, but forever considered a component of our mental health. As far back as the ancient Greeks, the Romans, the idea of pain and pleasure as these counterparts to our well-being, to our mental health, were considered essential. And all you need to know, all you need to realize, is that someone experiencing chronic pain is far more likely to experience something like depression. Well, obviously, because it's really, really difficult to experience a chronic pain condition. Perhaps more surprisingly is the other way around, that someone experiencing major depression is more likely to later in the future develop a chronic pain condition. Why might that be? Because of the interdependency of physical and mental health, and because the mechanisms driving chronic pain, in fact, have more in common with depression than they have with acute pain, stubbing your toe, having a temporary pain. So that means that we need to dive a little bit deeper into what might cause and relieve pain to understand its interrelationship with mental health. One example that I like to give is temporary bodily stressors, something like jumping in freezing cold water, which some of you might be a fan of. If you are, that's because it activates your endogenous opioid system, an inbuilt pain relief system, which, as the name suggests, is also targeted by opioid drugs. But you don't need to jump in cold water or take an opioid drug to exploit this natural pain relief system. You can, for example, laugh with friends while watching a comedy, which was shown also to release endogenous opioids and in fact have some pain-relieving properties. The reason all these different things affect pain, pleasure in the brain is because we have dotted around our brain, like hotspots on the planet, places that can generate pleasure, and they're a little bit distinct for each one of us. We also have places in the brain that can generate displeasure. But mental health, in my view, goes far beyond an immediate experience of something pleasant or unpleasant, happiness, pain, disgust. What affects our mental health is a much longer-term process. We need to learn about the world and predict the world, and from those mechanisms, have an idea of whether the world and our place in it is a good or bad one. So I want to tell you about a fundamental mechanism of the brain. It's not just important for mental health, it actually goes far beyond that. But I argue that it is also underpinning, to a large degree, our sense of mental health. And this mechanism is how our brain learns about the world, underpinned largely, but not entirely, by the dopamine system. So at the turn of the 21st century, some neuroscientists were recording from deep inside the brain of monkeys in this region that is dopamine-rich, full of dopamine neurons. And they found something quite extraordinary. So the monkeys were exposed to a flash of light followed by a taste of juice. Monkeys love juice. And initially, when measuring from these dopamine neurons, they spiked, they fired every time the monkeys tasted the delicious juice. But after a little while, because the flash of light preceded this taste of juice, something changed. Dopamine cells stopped firing to the juice and began to fire to the light, the thing that was predicting the reward. And in fact, after a little longer, if the light was shown and no reward received, say a drop of water instead, which is all right, but not as good as juice, the dopamine cells decreased their firing from baseline. This is a prediction error, a surprisingly positive outcome that dopamine is signaling. And initially, that occurs because they don't know the connection between the light and the juice. But after the monkeys have learned, so too have the dopamine cells. Or, you might say, the dopamine cells have underpinned or driven this learning process in the monkeys. And something called a negative or punishment, depending on who you ask, reward prediction error happens when the monkeys receive the water instead of the juice. They're sort of unlearning that initial positive learning mechanism. So the ability of dopamine to signal prediction errors is thought to be a fundamental drive for how and what we learn about the world. It's not obvious what this has to do with mental health, but I'll tell you. If I were to ask you all tonight, would you rather have £1 or 10? I'm not going to ask you. It's obvious. I'll take a tenner. But in fact, the answer is a little bit more complicated than that. Because if I ask you again and again and again, offering you different amounts of money with, just like the monkeys, a predictive symbol that tells you how much you're about to receive, your own happiness level actually depends on this equation here, but fundamentally, this bit of it, which stands for reward prediction error. Just like the monkeys, how happy you feel at an individual moment in time depends on the difference between what you were expecting and what you received. So, if you were expecting £8 but got 1, that's actually a lot worse than if you were expecting 1 and got 5. So this prediction error difference is true in the monkeys. It's underpinned by dopamine. In fact, this particular equation is also modified by dopamine in humans. But it's also crucial to your moment-by-moment assessment of your own mental well-being. Meaning that when you go about the world, things that you experience that accord or surprise you compared to your predictions are the things that will affect your mental health, for good or bad. So this tells us the first major component of mental health that I want to teach you about, which is that learning is central and, in fact, underpinned to some degree by dopamine. But of course, you've probably heard about dopamine before, and maybe in many different contexts, which is fair enough, because dopamine does many, many different things in the brain. But you might have heard about it in these contexts. Dopamine is a very hyped molecule, maybe the most hyped molecule right now. I mean, it's got a great reputation. Its reputation precedes it, but it's a little bit too positive. The facts of dopamine, which are just as exciting, albeit somewhat different than what is sometimes presented in popular media, are not that dopamine is some kind of pleasure molecule. In fact, as I've just told you, I think opioids in the brain might be a little bit closer to that. They're not that dopamine only does these really positive, addictive things and you should deprive yourself of dopamine. Actually, that's a terrible idea for many reasons. In fact, sometimes this is what neuroscientists call that. So the true story of dopamine is much more interesting. It is involved in movement, our ability to initiate movement. Depriving people of dopamine is the cause of Parkinson's disease and inability to initiate movement. It also underpins some mechanisms of drug addiction, compulsive drug seeking, for example, and it also has a lot to do with mental health, how we learn about the world, what we learn about the world. So this leads me to the second message, which is that this learning process, which is happening all the time, is not just passively going on in the background. It's actively changing your beliefs about the world. Often, your beliefs about the world are so strong that even small, surprising things are not substantial enough to update them. But sometimes, events in the world are so significant, or your beliefs are so uncertain, that an update of your expectations happen. And I think expectations, the way they're quantified in the brain, the way they're measured in the brain, is maybe close, if not entirely overlapping, with how we conceptualize mental health. Our subjective perception of the world is closely intertwined with what we expect to happen consciously and unconsciously in the world. Perhaps the best example of this is a placebo. You might have heard that placebos are inert, biologically inert. That's true in a dish, in a petri dish. But it's not true in the human brain. If someone takes a placebo, something they believe will have a biological effect on one process or another in the brain or the body, it has widespread effects in the brain, often, interestingly, corresponding to what you think you're taking. But there are some things in common, many things in common, in fact, with things that are affected, processes in the brain that are affected in mental health conditions. So placebos are only inactive outside the body. Once someone takes them, they're very, very active. And that's because our expectations have a biological manifestation, biological effect on the brain and body. The way they affect the body is actually very interesting. So by changing these various brain processes, they have what's called top-down effects on the body. That means cells in certain regions of your brain, through communication with the brainstem and the spinal cord, can affect bodily as well as brain processes. But I was a little misleading when I talked about mental health and the perception of the world that you live in. Because actually the world that you live in, yes, it's this room you're in right now and the spaces that you go about in your everyday life, but there's another world, a world that you carry with you all the time. And that's the inside world that you live in, unique to each one of you, and equally, I argue, important for your mental health. One way you might already be aware of this is that if you ask a bunch of people how they feel throughout the day, how happy do you feel, how irritable do you feel, and then you track their levels of hunger, you can do this through the blood, but also just when they've last eaten, there's this very clear correspondence that when people are low in hunger, they're relatively low in irritability, and when they're high in hunger, they're pretty high in irritability. We even have a lovely portmanteau for that. But the effects of your body on the brain can go actually on a much more minute scale than that. In beautiful work about 10 years ago, Sarah Garfinkel and Hugo Critchley showed that the beating of your heart, pumping blood systole and diastole in between heartbeats, affects your second-by-second perception of emotions in the world around you, such that when your heart beats, you're more likely to perceive something fearful, like a fearful face, compared to diastole in between beats. A few years ago, my lab showed a similar causal influence of the body on emotion through the stomach, where we modulated the rhythm of the stomach and found that people were less avoidant of disgust when their stomachs themselves were less disgusted. We did this by giving people an anti-nausea drug. And then finally, things that aren't constrained by specific organs, like the immune system, also exert an influence on your mental health. We've known this for a long time from big population studies, epidemiological studies. For example, people who have high levels of inflammation in the blood, so you can measure things like circulating cytokines, which increase in infection, but also increase when you experience stress. They have a common susceptibility to mental and physical health problems. So the immune system does seem to confer some kind of vulnerability to mental and physical health issues. But there's a problem with these studies. They're big, they're statistically very robust, but they could just be an association. It could be that the very same people who are likely to have heightened inflammation, for example, they live in certain environments, stressful environments, physically stressful environments, also are susceptible to mental health problems. That means we don't know if there's a causal link between the two. This isn't a unique problem to the immune system, I should say. There are other bodily systems you could make the same argument about. So what we need, and luckily in this case what we have, are experimental manipulations in the lab where we can increase levels of inflammation and look at how it affects mental health. So one of the ways that we can do that as scientists is to give people a vaccine. Some vaccines immediately increase levels of inflammation in the body, for example, the flu vaccine. We can then measure levels of circulating cytokines and other markers of inflammation. And in some people, though not everyone, this affects your mood. The more it affects your mood, the more it affects your immune system, or vice versa. The more it affects your immune system, the more it affects your mood. So if you are the kind of person who, like me, feels particularly blue when they have a cold, I would say really down and unpleasant to be around in my case, you might be someone whose immune system is more closely coupled with your mental health than other people. And this could give us a clue how for some people targeting the immune system could be a new route to treating mental health. So I would argue the body is a critical, albeit slightly neglected, ingredient of mental health. But I don't think the body passively informs mental health. I don't think of these two groups of ingredients that I've told you about, these expectations about the world, things you've learned about the world, and processes in your body influencing your mental health, are separate. They are very much intertwined through your nervous system. And one of the most interesting ways in which they're intertwined is not just that processes in the body influence your feelings, your cognition, your emotions, but the other way around. Things happening in your brain can influence your immune system. There was this incredible study recently that it was so exciting, where they measured brain activity in a particular region of the brain when animals were subjected to inflammation in the gut. And then they treated the inflammation in the gut, the animals got better, and they reactivated that gut inflammation by simply stimulating the same cells in the brain. That means that the brain can cause physical inflammatory states in the body, not just react or respond to them. In humans, one of the ways that we measure this is via the process of interoception. So what you're doing right now, mostly, probably, is exteroception. You're seeing me, you're hearing, you're sitting. But some of you might also be doing some interoception. You might be thinking, oh, I'm a little bit hungry, or maybe my heart is beating quite quickly, I'm quite thirsty. All of this sense of the internal condition of the body, is interoception. And we can measure it in many different ways. We can measure it inside a brain scanner, for example, as many people have done. And in fact, if you measure it inside the brain scanner for people experiencing a mental health condition, compared to those not experiencing a mental health condition, what we've found are disruptions in various places, but particularly in the insula, the same region that the scientists recorded from and stimulated to reenact that inflammatory gut state in animals. So that's one key brain region in generating your sense of the internal condition of the body. One key potential target for treating that in future. So, yes, things in the body are affecting your mental health. Of course, things in the body are affecting your physical health. I'm using here an example of back pain, perhaps one of the most common disabilities in the world. Very, very difficult to treat. Processes in the brain are critical to even a symptom like back pain, not obviously a mental health symptom. That's because even back pain is filtered through these very same mechanisms. Your expectations about the state of the body, your inflammation, bidirectional influences on that, and also, of course, interoception, your sense of the internal condition of the body. So everything from your sense of how you're feeling emotionally to how you're physically feeling is computed via these parallel processes in the brain. Where does mental health come from? It comes from these states of expectations in the world, beliefs about the world around you. It comes from states inside the body, and of course, the interaction between those two. So our own sense of mental health in this immediate moment, or when we think about our wider life around us, comes from these two sets of processes, their interplay in your particular brain. And this tells us something about how treatments, both the ones we know about and perhaps the ones we don't yet know about, might affect our mental health. In some cases, treatments target our expectations, our beliefs about the world around us to improve mental health. In other cases, they target our body. So I wanted to start with talking about how antidepressants work. I started with antidepressants because I think it's probably one of the most obvious mental health treatments, but it's also one in which there are lots of different sort of competing explanations for how antidepressants might or might not work to treat depression and other mental health symptoms, because they're not just used to treat depression. For a long time, but I would say it's been a while since we've used that explanation, a scientist might have told you that they treat a chemical deficit in the brain, specifically one of serotonin. The reason why we thought that is because back in the 1950s, some scientists accidentally found that antidepressants, what we now think of as antidepressants, which raise levels of serotonin among other neurotransmitters in the brain, accidentally treated mood in patients with tuberculosis. We call this a serendipitous finding, which is a little more elegant than accidental. So this serendipitous finding led to a dominant theory of where depression might come from. Perhaps it was caused by these sort of chemical deficits because serotonin worked to treat them. That's where that story that you might be familiar with came from. But I would say it's been more than 15 years since that has been the kind of dominant story within neuroscience. There is some evidence to suggest that raising levels of serotonin is one reason that antidepressants work, but it cannot be the only reason, and I'll tell you why. Because antidepressants immediately raise levels of serotonin, but if any of you have ever taken an antidepressant, you know that they do not immediately improve your mood. They take weeks to work. So they must have an action, a critical action, an all-important action on your mental health that goes beyond that kind of micro level, that molecular level. I think some of the most important directions in this work come from a neuropsychological explanation of how antidepressants work. So, what this explanation suggests, and this is led by Catherine Harmer and Phil Cowan at Oxford, but now adopted by many other people, is that a single dose of antidepressants doesn't change your mood, but it does change your cognition, your perception of the world around you. This is actually, to some degree, true in everyone, even if you don't have depression. For many people, a single dose or a couple doses of antidepressants will change your perception of faces. It will change your perception of ambiguous sentences. And in the real world, if you're walking down the corridor at work one day and your colleague doesn't say hello to you, that's an example of an ambiguous stimulus. One person might interpret that as your colleague's a bit busy. Another person might interpret that as your colleague probably secretly hates you. And that's the kind of information that antidepressants work on. A shift from a negative interpretational bias towards a neutral or sometimes positive interpretational bias. And this is a small change in your perception of the world around you. It's not enough to change your mood. 1 or 2 or 3 of these is not enough to change your mood. But after weeks of experiencing the world in a slightly more neutral or slightly more positive way, that's enough to change mood. But only in some people. So the message I want to give you about antidepressants is that they are effective, and I think this is why they're effective, in a number of people, about 60%, but they're not in a large number of people with depression. And we still don't entirely understand why that is, but I would suggest it's because different people with depression do not necessarily have the same biological neural causes of their depression. So antidepressants are clearly working on some people's neural causes of their depression and not on others. So we need other solutions. For many people, talk therapy, like cognitive behavioral therapy, is one of those solutions. And in some of our work, we've found that talk therapy actually works on different areas in the brain to antidepressants. So it's not that talk therapy is not a biological treatment. I think of it as a biological treatment because it affects the brain. But it does affect a distinct area, an area more involved in your awareness of your own emotional state, compared to to antidepressant drugs, which you can see on top, which affect the amygdala involved in your immediate perception of your emotional state. So, for example, something like that interaction with a colleague, that would be affected by your amygdala, and less so by your general feeling state, which might be affected by cognitive behavioral therapy. This suggests that whilst both can change how you're feeling, can change your mental health via changes to the brain, they do so via different routes. I think an important clue into who they might work for. We know they don't necessarily work for the same people. So potentially a closer understanding of what a treatment is doing at the level of the brain could lead us towards a future where we could identify who a treatment might work for, even before giving it out. But of course, there are also other treatments you've maybe heard quite a lot about recently. And I wanted to talk about psilocybin or psychedelic drugs more generally, partially because one of the dominant explanations for how they work is that they too affect your expectations of the world around you. But unlike antidepressants, which affect a sort of bottom-up, many small changes in how you process information about the world, psilocybin and other psychedelics are thought to exert a much grander influence on your beliefs, perhaps, in some arguments, weakening your beliefs, your expectations about the world, maybe increasing your likelihood to challenge those beliefs, maybe increasing your susceptibility to prediction errors. So there are many interesting theories about how psychedelics affect your mental health. There's a second reason why I wanted to talk about psychedelics and expectations, and that's because of a paper I read that I just love the title of, called Tripping on Nothing. This paper showed that when presented with a novel psychedelic drug, which was in fact a placebo, a small majority, about 60% of people, reported classic psychedelic effects from that placebo. So most of you would experience some psychedelic effects from a placebo. That means that a critical avenue towards future research in psychedelics must disentangle what is an expectation effect, a placebo effect, which are very powerful but don't necessarily require magic mushrooms, and what effects are coming from the drug themselves. There are lots of interesting ways to do this. So you can use, for example, an active placebo, something else that kind of makes people feel high but doesn't necessarily mimic precisely the actions of a psychedelic drug. But it's rarely done. And I think means that at the moment, when we look at results from many psychedelic studies, it's actually a combination of things, a combination of people's expectations and the effects of the drugs themselves that we're looking at. But of course, many treatments work via the other route, via the body. And I want to tell you about three in particular: the potential for anti-inflammatory treatments, the utility of exercise as a mental health treatment, and the beloved utility of targeting the microbiome for mental health. So anti-inflammatory drugs have been explored as a potential treatment for multiple different types of mental health symptoms, including psychosis, but also depression and anxiety, with mixed results, just to give it away here. Sometimes they look very effective. There's reason to believe that they should be effective if you look at that data on inflammatory markers in depression, for example. But sometimes they don't look so effective. Why might that be? I would suggest it's because that sort of group effect, saying most people with depression have raised levels of inflammation, is only that. It's an average. And in fact, looking at an individual with depression and whether that particular person has raised levels of inflammation, and perhaps even going a level deeper and saying, well, which inflammatory markers are raised, and what about a drug that targets those particular inflammatory markers? That's the avenue that we need for this sort of research. It is not a silver bullet, but it is an important line of research, of clinical treatment for some people, in my view. Similarly, you might have heard of exercise as a panacea for just about everything. And I'm not really here to dismantle that. I also think there's very good data that exercise is quite helpful in lots of ways. But the most convincing data, like with the initial hints for inflammation, comes from epidemiological studies. Really significant effects of exercise when looked at correlationally in the population with mood and levels of mental health symptoms. So why might that be? Well, people with greater burden of mental health symptoms are less likely to exercise, is what a skeptic might say. And it's the people who are feeling mentally great who are out for a run every day. That's called a confound. So researchers have looked in depth into whether that might be driving these symptoms and these correlations, and to some degree it is contributing, but it doesn't seem to be the entire explanation. And if you run a randomized control trial of exercise versus a pretty good control for depression, you tend to get an effect of exercise on mood. So that suggests there is, in fact, a causal role of exercise on mental health. Why? Well, honestly, it's still a little bit of a mystery. Some people like to point to the inflammatory system as a mechanism. Other people point to factors like self-efficacy, feeling like you can achieve something. And the truth is probably that there are many different systems that exercise affects in the body, but also in the brain, that then end up affecting someone's mental health. It's also important to note that, like other interventions, just because exercise is a lifestyle intervention and one we sort of love in society, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily a mental health intervention for everyone. For some people, it might be unsuitable simply because their symptoms prevent them from exercising. It's sort of genuinely impossible. For other people, there's data, epidemiological data, to suggest that at the highest level, people exercising very frequently, they actually have worse mental health than people exercising at a sort of moderate level. So we don't really know why that is, but I would suggest that it might mean we need to look a little deeper at who we suggest exercise more and not just sort of assume it's a linear relationship. And finally, the gut microbiome has been an area of really active exploration in mental health. I would say there is great evidence in kind of two domains here. One is the population level evidence. So as with inflammation, if you look at the population, it looks like people with more diverse microbiomes have lower mental health symptoms, lower depression, lower anxiety. It's also true if you look at animal studies, in particular rodent studies. So this is a special case where you can causally change a rodent's microbiome by entirely changing its environments, also sometimes its genes, and then look at the consequences on sort of mental health-like behavior in rodents. And there seems to be a connection there too. You might be sensing that there's a little bit of a gap, which is humans. And that's where the evidence is, I think, still a little bit unclear. So it's a very exciting avenue of research, but what's not clear at the moment is that link, like an inflammation between the vaccine and mental health, between changing someone's microbiome, a human's microbiome, and changing their mental health. So it could be that in our microbiome worlds, the world is almost too complex to be affected by eating a little more kimchi, which I love, but it might not affect my mental health. Because even right now, the person you're sitting next to is affecting your microbiome. So it's very, very difficult to control for in a scientific experiment. And I think, keep an eye on this field, but it's not a definitive link yet. In the final portion, I want to tell you about whether we have a mental health crisis right now or not. This is a really challenging area at the moment. So one of the reasons I study mental health is because mental health has either affected any of you personally or someone you know personally. It is that common. Many cite it as the world's leading cause of disability, mental health conditions as the world's leading cause of disability. And even outside of mental health conditions, of course, our own mental health affects us all. So it's clearly, in terms of our health, a very, very significant sign. But how do we measure this sign? I began by saying, well, economists conceptualize it differently from animal scientists, and in fact, they conceptualize it slightly differently from if you were to ask a psychiatrist or a clinical psychologist. So how do we grapple with something that has such a broad array of definitions? And how do we identify when we have a problem? So many people will tell you that we have a very big problem right now because numbers of diagnoses are skyrocketing, particularly among young people. I would suggest that is not necessarily a problem because it depends on the cause. So over the past few decades, people have had vastly better access to information and clinical treatment, increasing numbers of diagnoses. So that's not necessarily a bad thing. But if you take diagnoses out of the picture, there is still a sort of what you might think of as a genuine increase in mental health burden in the population, especially quite recently, and especially in young people and adolescents. Why might that be? Well, everyone has different explanations, depending on their expertise, depending on sort of what they're citing. You might get some COVID, you might get some social media, you might get some, we're obviously in a time of economic difficulty, but you might also get a sense that there's another contribution to young people's mental health, which is a kind of, within youth culture, there has become greater and greater affiliation with mental health symptoms, mental health burden. And I think this is a positive thing, not just a negative thing, but I also think it can have some negative consequences. So some researchers have begun looking at whether our increased efforts towards mental health awareness have in fact themselves affected some people's mental health. A researcher called Lucy Folks has looked into this and suggests that one contribution towards increasing burden of youth mental health problems is our increasing discussion of mental health problems in and of itself. So this is just a suggestion, but I want to give you a picture of sort of how different researchers are advocating for different contributions to what is causing this crisis. And because of that, there isn't necessarily one clear solution. There might be many. I would argue that with whatever the cause is, we need to understand proximal, within the body, within the brain, contributors to all of our mental health. Because in fact, these very same mechanisms are what would drive an effect of our economy on mental health, what would drive the effect of global warming on mental health, what would drive the effect of online bullying or in-person bullying on mental health. It is all via these very same mechanisms in the brain and wider nervous system. There are many different paths to poor mental health. There are many different contributors to poor mental health, close ones and faraway ones. People's childhood, people's experiences throughout their lives, people's genes, making them more and less susceptible to these. But all is not lost, because mental health, while it may seem ephemeral, it may seem personal, it may seem entirely subjective, can be measured, quantified, and therefore changed. I would suggest there are myriad paths to poor mental health, but there are just as many ways out. Thank you very much.